Bridget McKenzie's been caught up in a fresh grants controversy. Let's bring in our political editor, Andrew Clennell. Now, Andrew, the Prime Minister's been saying throughout this sports rorts drama that all the grants have been eligible, but now there are questions about the Drought Communities Program, of which the Minister had oversight as well.
Sports rorts program, Bridget McKenzie was not going strictly by the book when she handed out money during the election campaign. This time it's the Drought Communities Program. Of 14 Drought Communities Program grants she handed out, 6 were ineligible under the government's own criteria because they did not have the requirement of 17% of people in the council area having to work in agriculture. Now, the biggest example of this was in her great mate Darren Chester's electorate, Gippsland, where the Trobe Council received $1 million despite just 2.92% of the population working in agriculture. That's a big gap from 17%. Another South Australian electorate, Grey, received the money, a Liberal electorate, despite just 4.24% being farmers. So the person running away from this at the moment is the bloke who has taken over the scheme, who wants Ms McKenzie's deputy's job. It's David Littleproud. We'll get to him in a minute, but Scott Morrison has made much of the fact that all the sports rorts grants were eligible, strictly speaking, even though it's been confirmed they were aimed at targeted marginal seats. These drought ones weren't within the criteria, but the government is claiming they are because there was a special clause or disclaimer in the criteria, that a provision that you could use ministerial discretion, whether it met the criteria or not. Now, this subject came up in Senate estimates last year, and Barnaby Joyce's former Chief of Staff, Diane Hallam, who's now a departmental official, made some admissions around criteria around these 14 grants. Let's have a listen to that.
14 local government areas were announced as being eligible for the Drought Communities Program extension within the election period.
So 14 of these councils, yes, who are eligible,
well, who've received the $1 million.
So 14 of the councils who've received this drought funding actually don't meet the eligibility criteria.
Well, I can't comment on whether they meet the eligibility criteria, but it wasn't subject to departmental analysis.
Right. Do you know whether they're whether they meet the criteria?
No, I'm afraid I've not. I don't have that information with me at the moment.
And so now, as we know, a number of them didn't. Nearly half of them didn't meet the criteria, but the government's relying on this catch-all ministerial discretion to say, well, that's fine, they might not have met the benchmark, but she had the discretion to override that. Is that damaging, do you believe, in the context of the sports rorts drama?
I think these new revelations are pretty damaging because, again, it raises real questions about Ms McKenzie's handling of public money. We've seen the sports rorts affair, marginal and targeted seats. Clearly, there are electorates there where a real argument could be made that other electorates or councils should have got the grants, had better scores on the criteria. It just seems so much occurs at this minister's discretion. And of course, we remember the shooting survey we revealed, 160 grand to show that shooting might be good for your physical health, or it might not. So just more questions about this minister's administration of her portfolio. Of course, she's waiting on a report to see if she stands down or is sacked. One person who, as I said, is running away from this is David Littleproud. He took over the scheme in his portfolio. She had it in regional services. He took over responsibility in July after these particular grants. He was asked about it in Kempsey today and had an interesting response. Let's just listen to that, Kieran.
Well, that wasn't my decision. I wasn't responsible for the program prior to the election. I only took ownership of the program after the election, and that's when I undertook a review. I wasn't the minister responsible for those shires. You'd have to ask the minister responsible at the time.
Now, we went to Bridget McKenzie's office about this, and interestingly, she tried to point the finger a little bit at David Littleproud, tried to get him to share responsibility. Very interesting, given his comments there. Let's have a look at that statement from her office if we can. She said that any decision to approve council areas as eligible for the program is set out in the guidelines and involves consultation between the Minister for Regional Development and Minister for Agriculture and Water Resources. So she's saying she consulted Littleproud. She says when the Minister came into the regional development portfolio, she established a criteria that drew on rainfall deficiency data and agricultural workforce participation numbers to inform ministerial decisions around specifying councils for the program. That's that 17% figure I told you about. And she says ministerial discretion on final funding decisions exists to ensure councils that do not meet the rigid thresholds, she says her own thresholds are rigid, can still access support or be given the grants. And that's certainly what happened here. You wonder why you have criteria in the first place, Kieran.
Yeah, and the question is now, Andrew, and I guess it's been the question we've been wondering, speculating on all week, is will or won't she survive as a minister, as a cabinet minister? A senior government source said to me earlier today, Andrew, that Bridget would be okay in a court of law. Technically, she's okay, but the problem for her is we're not in a court of law, is what was said to me. So even those senior members of government are saying, well, technically she might be okay, as you know, particularly in this drought grant situation, saying, well, she had the overriding discretion, but we're not in a court of law, and does it pass the pub test and or you know, the political survival test? My instinct is right now still it doesn't.
No way. And look, that's the issue, isn't it? I mean, fortunately, we are in a situation, a democracy, where you don't have to prove things beyond reasonable doubt. If it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, you usually see ministers go, and that's what we're looking at, I think, here. Trying to get off on a technicality, that doesn't quite work. And it's interesting that you've spoken to colleagues of her who have that view that pretty much sort of says that she is going to go. She might argue that technically she's in the right, but it doesn't matter in the court of public opinion, does it?